Hey everybody, it's Brother Peyton here again. This is going to be, I've lost track of what number of video this is, but that doesn't really matter. Here again, YouTube video. Um, Part that we're going to be talking about today. Remember last week on the last video, I mentioned that where we're at now in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is starting to wrap things up. This is sort of the end part of his sermon. So last week we discussed asking, seeking, and knocking. Remember, we talked about asking Jesus into our hearts, seeking his will for our life. And when we get to that door, he answers it. We receive what we've been seeking. Now, the part that we get to now, it's only going to be 2 verses. We're only going to look at 2 verses for this lesson. So it's not going to be quite as long as the previous videos, but there's so much that we can unpack from just these 2 verses, because even though this is, of course, Jesus, speaking in metaphors and stuff like that to represent things, we talk about his parables. This isn't necessarily a parable that he gives as so much as just a short metaphor, but what this metaphor means is the essence of Christian life, the essence of following what Jesus wants us to do, living like him, is the way he puts it here, is so simple, but yet it means everything. Again, it's sort of the essence of what it means to follow Jesus, to be a Christian. So, again, it's going to be 2 verses. This is Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14 is what we're going to be discussing. But just want to go on and give out this disclaimer here for the next couple of videos that we're going to be having. When we get to them, starting in verse 13, where we're at now, and going to verse 29, which is what ends chapter 7. This is Jesus, again, like I said, the end of the sermon, wrapping things up. He's going to start splitting everything into sort of two groups. Remember, again, like I said last week, what we talked about was Jesus. Up until this point, he's been going through bits and pieces of the law. Remember, we've talked about very specific things: judging others, giving to the needy, adultery, stuff like that. We've gone through very specific pieces that Jesus has gone through, broken down, and told us how we should approach these things and how they can apply to our life, how we should approach them, and the way in which we can behave like him facing things like this. So that's what we've been going through in the Sermon on the Mount. Where we're at now, Jesus, like I said, is wrapping things up, and he's going to, from verse 13 to verse 29, he splits stuff up. He splits everything into 2 groups. He's like, there's one way to get to heaven. There's another way that leads to the opposite end of heaven. There's going to be true prophets, and there's going to be false prophets. There's going to be true disciples, and there are going to be false disciples. There's going to be wise builders, and there's going to be foolish builders. All right, and the wise builder builds his foundation, builds his house on a strong, sturdy foundation, whereas the foolish builder does not. It's very easy. It's very cut and dry. It's very, again, there's a line split down the middle, one end or the other. And that's what Jesus does in this last portion of his sermon here. It's where he's pretty much splitting the world in half. It's either you are or you are not a Christian. You either are on the path of salvation or you are not. You are either on your way to heaven or you are not. There's no in between. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's either you are or you are not. And this verses 13 and 14 are the beginning of him diving into that and explaining how that is. So verses 13 and 14 are some, like I said, some of the most crucial verses for Christians, because it explains our walk, perfectly. So we're going to get into verses 13 and 14. Again, this is Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. So let's read what Jesus had to say. And he says, "Enter through the narrow gate, For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. So, like I said, we're only going to be going through these 2 verses. So this lesson, this video isn't going to be quite as long, but again, there's so much here that we can unpack from these 2 verses. So, enter through the narrow gate. This is Jesus' command to us, and he's going to explain to us what the narrow gate is. But before he gets to explaining the narrow gate to everybody he's speaking to here, he offers up the description of what the wide gate is. He says, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. It's very simple what this means. On this path that we call life, going through the road is wide, and the gate at the end of the road is wide, and it is easy to go through. And that's the path of the world. And that's what the world would have us to do. That's the life of sin, the life of self-fulfillment, self-righteousness, thinking that we have everything under control and that everything that we need is brought on by ourselves, that God had nothing to do with it, that we have lived our life for ourself and ourself alone. And that is the view of many, many people. All right. So, sorry, I had to get my notes to where I could see them. So, when we get into this, both narrow and the wide gate. Let's explain what the gates are. The gates are assumed to be, of course, entering into God's kingdom. We've talked about the gates of heaven and stuff like that. We've talked about that kind of stuff before. So the narrow gate, of course, is presumed to be the entrance into heaven, whereas the wide gate would be the entrance into hell, the opposite of heaven, absence, being completely absent from God. And that is the gate that the majority of the world finds themselves going to. It is the gate that is offered up through stuff like sort of the teaching that all roads lead to heaven. That if you're a good person, that if you offer up your time to the needy or to some sort of organization, some sort of charity, then you're good. So long as your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, you're good to go. You'll get into heaven. But the thing is, it's not the case. Because if that were the case, a lot of people would be getting to heaven. But what Jesus says is that the road to destruction is the big path, is the wide path and the path that many follow. And that's that path that us thinking that our good deeds, like I said, giving to the needy, offering up our time for charities and organizations and stuff like that, that's not what gets us into heaven. Okay, we've got to understand that. That us thinking that we have anything to do with getting into heaven, that's complete opposite. It's just wrong. We have nothing to do with us getting into heaven. That's all Jesus. If we go to Acts chapter 4, verse 12, we have a verse that explains this perfectly. Again, that's Acts chapter 4, verse 12. And what we have written here says, "And there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven that has been given among men by which we must be saved." That name being Jesus. The only way we get into heaven is through Jesus. So, naturally, the opposite end of this. We've talked about the broad, wide road. And what that is, of course, is the way of the world, the way of self-fulfillment, the way of self-righteousness, thinking that we are right with God because of our own actions. The opposite end of that is the narrow road leading to the narrow gate. And that narrow road, this is Jesus. The narrow path, the narrow gate is Jesus. The only way into heaven is Jesus. And the way that I've heard it described before, and it's a very good way of thinking about it, is if you imagine, say, like a big, wide interstate, all right, where cars are going one way, 70 miles an hour, as fast as they can. That is the wide road that leads to destruction. Okay, it's easy, it's one way, there's nothing in your way, it's just going straight as fast as you can go. Following Jesus, on the other hand, is if you think about the center stripe, stripes in the middle of the interstate. That's the road, but not only are you on this little bitty path in the middle of the interstate, you're not going the direction the rest of the cars are going. You're turned backwards and you're walking like in the direction of the cars. That's the narrow road that's following Jesus. You're turned around on the interstate going in the direction of the cars, and you've got this little bitty path to walk in. That's the narrow road and gate that is Jesus. And Jesus stresses it all throughout the Gospels. When he is preaching, he talks about, continually, there's numerous stories you can find of Jesus stressing to his disciples and all those people following him that following me is difficult. Okay, it's not easy. And I can only imagine how difficult it would be to walk down the middle of the interstate with cars coming at you, trying to stay in the middle of the road. Okay, it's a hard thing to try to do, but following Jesus isn't easy, because in this metaphor of walking backwards against the interstate with the cars coming at you, remember, that's the way of the world. The world is constantly coming at you, offering new temptations, new things to try to dive into, new ways to go against Jesus. There's always something new coming at us, and it's coming fast. All right, remember, we're on the interstate, so cars aren't going slow. And not only are we walking against that, our path that we are trying to stay on is very, very small. So it's very easy to get knocked off that path and get knocked around by these cars and stuff like that, to get knocked around by the world. It's very easy. But Jesus never said anything otherwise. He never said that if you try to follow me, it's going to be a smooth, even path. He never made that promise. He said that we would never be alone in walking that path, that he would be right there with us, that he is out in front of us making sure that we can get through whatever obstacle might be in the way. But he didn't say there wouldn't be obstacles, because there will be, and there are. So Jesus, when he is doing this, of course, what he is saying here essentially is that in order to get into heaven, there is but one way, and it is to go on this narrow gate, a narrow road that leads to this narrow gate. And that narrow road, of course, is Jesus. He's talking about himself. He's making a metaphor about himself. Jesus says that I am the way, the truth, and the life, that no one comes to the Father but through me. Okay? When Jesus says that, he means it. There is no plurality here, okay? There is no, you can do this or you can do that, whatever you want to do. No. Jesus says there's one way, and it's me. Jesus says if you follow any other path, you're not getting into heaven. Jesus says the only way into heaven is to follow me along this narrow path. to go against what the world says, to go against the ways of the world, instead of being hateful and rude, selfish, greedy, self-fulfilling, stuff like that. Jesus calls us to be meek, kind, loving, giving. He calls us to be the opposite of what the world teaches us. The world teaches us that this says that you have to get by on your own, and if you don't, you get left behind. Jesus says, don't be that way. That if someone is being left behind, you reach back to help them. That if there is somebody in need, you offer your assistance. That you don't hate those that hate you. Instead, you love them and you care for them and you pray for them. And the people who claim to be on your side, if they're doing stuff that isn't what they're supposed to be doing, you tell them, look, get back on this road with me. We're supposed to help each other out. And you're not exactly helping us out by behaving like the rest of the world. That's what Jesus tells us to do. He wants us to make sure that we can take this wide road, that while we are walking backwards on this path, against the cars coming at us, he wants us to reach out into the sides of this wide road, and he wants us to grab people, as many people as we can, and pull them into the middle with us, to turn them back to facing him. That's what Jesus wants us to do while we're on this narrow path. And because there's going to be opportunities. Remember, like I said, these cars are coming at us nonstop. All right, we're on the interstate. Cars are coming constantly, and they're coming fast. But like I said, as difficult as that sounds, and as difficult as it is, Jesus is there with us. Jesus is always there with us, and he's always going to be there to offer assistance, to tell us what we need to say, to offer the way in which we need to go. And while we are on that path, the way in which we are walking, because think about it. If you were on the interstate and you saw somebody in the middle of the road walking back against the traffic, you'd wonder, what on earth is up with that person? What are they doing? That's the way the world should see us as Christians. It would definitely get your attention if you saw that person. We should get the attention of people by the way in which we act, by the way in which we talk, by the way in which we interact with others. It should get people's attention. It should make them wonder, what is that person's deal? What are they doing? What makes them so different? That is the way the world, the rest of the world, non-Christians, should see us as Christians. And it shouldn't be for negative reasons. They shouldn't see us as a Christian and think they hate everybody other than themselves. The only people they like are Christians. Because Jesus tells us not to do that very specifically. We've gone over this before in this series through this sermon that Jesus is giving. There he says, if you only love people who love you back, if you are a Christian and you say that you only love other Christians, you're doing it wrong. Jesus said very specifically that if you are a Christian that only loves Christians back, only loves those that love you back, you're no different than the rest of the world. So it's very clear, guys, that Jesus says here when we talk about going on this narrow path, it's not easy. It's difficult. It's hard to do, but it catches the attention of people. And if it catches the attention of people for the right reason, if we are able to get the attention of people because we are loving, we are caring, we are kind, we are able to speak to anyone with love and respect and show them the way that Jesus wants them to go, we're doing something right. And the path will be a little easier if we follow it that way. It gets difficult whenever we start looking at the world and thinking, I can do that and it'll be okay. Or Jesus won't notice this one little thing. Don't let that be your mindset. Because it's easy. Like I said, guys, with these cars coming out at 70 miles an hour, it's easy to take one bad step and get wiped out by a car. It's easy to take one bad step on the narrow path and get wiped out by the world. It's easy. But true followers of Jesus, if we're able to keep our eyes set and focused on Him, we will get there. Remember last week we talked about asking, seeking, and knocking. If you seek what Jesus wants, you'll get to the door. If you seek Him out on this narrow path, you'll get to the gate that is heaven, that leads to heaven. All right, guys, so I hope that, again, like I said, it's a little shorter of a video because it's only a couple verses, but there's so much there. And it's the truth of what it is to be a Christian, is that the rest of the world tells you there's numerous ways to get to heaven, and we say, no, there's only one way. And that one way is a very difficult way to follow, but it is well worth it. So, guys, I hope that helps you guys, teaches you a little bit. If you have a question, comment, concern, whatever it may be, please text me, whatever it may be. If you don't have my number, of course, the comment section is open on the video. You can leave your question, your comment, concern, whatever it may be. You can leave that there. I can look at it and I can try to answer your question or respond to your comment, whatever it may be. Just again, want to implore everybody that watches this, that sees this, to follow the mandates set by our government officials to keep us safe during this time of this pandemic, this virus that is spreading. Stay safe, wash your hands, and love you guys.